Thank you for joining us. In the next half hour, we're going to talk about missing and murdered Indigenous people in Alaska. We know that in 30 minutes, we won't solve the issue, but our goal is to keep the discussion going, to keep it in the forefront. It's such a broad subject. We're going to start with a brief look at the issue. Here's Beth Verge.
There's too much acceptance for this. You know, we say we don't accept it, but so many cases go unreported. So many cases get minimized. So many cases get, well, you know, that it happened and we move on. But we need to, as individuals, as communities, as the state, to say, no, this is not an acceptable behavior, and we are no longer going to tolerate it.
The issue of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples in Alaska, urban and rural incidents alike, is a multi-layered and complicated one, especially when you consider what's often behind it.
You can't deal with just one of these issues and think you're going to solve the problem. You've got to deal with the whole host of issues that are out there in order to begin digging down through the layers and layers of issues that lead to this kind of behavior.
We know from recent data that there exists an alarming prevalence of violence in Alaska and among Alaska Native men, women, and children. Cases resulting in death are often linked to sexual violence and human trafficking, both of which tend to be underreported.
The saddest story I think I've heard over the years is mothers and grandmothers and aunties having to teach their children how to respond or what to do when, not if, when they are abused or mistreated or somebody raises a hand to them, because it's become so prevalent.
But missing statistics and the lack of a comprehensive database of state and federal information specific to MMIP have proven challenging in even communicating the pervasiveness of the problem.
There is a lot about this topic that we don't know, that there's a lot about this topic that lacks an Alaska-specific context. So when the national conversation about missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, or homicide generally, when that national conversation is ongoing, oftentimes Alaska is either thrown in with the national data without much regard for anything Alaska specific, or it's excluded entirely.
Of the few reports available, some combine the data of the missing and murdered into one. For example, the Urban Indian Health Institute says that in 2016, Alaska saw 52 incidents of missing and murdered Indigenous women, one of the highest case counts in the country, despite it not being a per capita ranking. Other agencies separate the two types of reports out.
We're dealing with two issues here, missing and then somebody being killed, murder.
A University of Alaska Anchorage Justice Information Center study on homicides in Alaska over the past 40 years, from 1976 to 2016, showed that of all reported victims, more than a third were American Indian or Alaskan Native. Of all suspects, more than 20% were of the same descent.
Alaska Natives tend to be present more frequently than we would anticipate just looking at their general population numbers. When it comes to missing persons and homicide, we have questions that are left unanswered, and it's very unsatisfying. It's not like an episode of television where at the end of the 42 minutes, everybody has all of the answers. We know exactly who did it, how, and for what reason. A lot of the time, we don't know whether anything happened at all.
But with increased awareness of cases comes more questions and a more intense quest for answers. Beth Verge, Alaska's news source.
And joining us is our panel of experts, Charlene Uphook with the Anchorage Public Safety Advisory Commission and the Executive Director at Data for Indigenous Justice, Brian Schroeder, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Alaska, Alex Cleghorn, Legal and Policy Director for the Alaska Native Justice Center. Thank you all so much for joining us. And of course, I want to start tonight, though, let's start with that big question. Alex, one of the questions that we have been hearing is why now? Why are we just now, as a state, as a country, addressing this issue of missing and murdered Indigenous peoples?
Well, I think it is because of ongoing advocacy and efforts of folks in the community of Native Alaskan women, Native Alaskan people who are continually raising the issue up and not giving up. I think also that there has started to be more of a response from some of our federal partners, and I think that hopefully the message that Alaska is different and distinct continues to be said and heard so that people are paying attention to the issues that are specific to us.
And Charlene, why do you think the world is just now listening to the voices of Indigenous people and acknowledging the pain?
Right, much like Alex shared, the communities and our people have been long standing up and demanding justice and ready to be heard. And that's really powerful. The more that we speak to it and we see that it isn't just us, it isn't just isolated incidents, we see that it's happening across the board and we see that it's a systemic issue.
And Charlene, it seems like younger people have been some of the people leading the charge, at least in public, pointing out injustices. Why do you think that they are shining light on past wrongs?
Yeah, I think that a lot of we work on this issue with the support and the backing of our communities, and we work for and with our community. So we're listening to other people, elders, we're listening to our families, we're listening to tribes, and we're putting that forward as we're able to have access and to these different spaces and to communicate with one another on what we're doing and a strategy moving forward.
And Brian Schroeder, the focus of most of these discussions, it has been missing and murdered Indigenous women, but the CDC says it's the 7th leading cause of death in Indigenous men. Should we be expanding the focus?
Oh, I think we should, and I think we are. The federal initiatives under the Department of Justice are, the term we use is missing and murdered Indigenous persons. So we are looking at both women and men, the missing and murdered Native American and Alaska Native women and men. Let me add something though to what Alex and Charlene said about the ongoing advocacy. I completely agree with that. Alex mentioned federal partners, and I think the other thing that's happened is we have now we found a willing audience in Washington. Attorney General Barr, who came to Alaska and visited, started an MMIP initiative. The White House started an MMIP initiative called Operation Lady Justice. So I think in the past year or so, we have gotten a group of people in Washington who are willing to listen.
Charlene, you've spoken of data gaps, that there are discrepancies in the data between the feds, state, and local agencies. How does this play a role in continuing to harm Alaska Natives?
Yeah, so what that does is when we have a data gap, it means that we have a gap in being able to advocate for resources when we aren't able to name and spell out what we need and what's happening and what the impacts are. And so Data for Indigenous Justice has really tried to compile the data and the information that's available so that communities and tribes can advocate and say, this is what's happening and we need something done about it.
Alex, you've said in other interviews that it is good now that the public is talking about this, giving attention to public safety in Alaska. How accurate at this point do you think the data is?
Well, I think that the data, it still has gaps, but I think that I know that when you look at the data that we do have, it is unacceptable, right? Not just the missing and murdered, but we have a problem with violence against women, and particularly violence against Alaska Native women in Alaska. As Brian mentioned, the U.S. Attorney came to visit, and his visit to Alaska led him to declaring a public safety emergency in our state. And I think that the combination of the data that we do have, along with the attention that's being paid, will hopefully spark further action. This issue is not new. Right? There are 40 years of federal studies, commissions, committees, state commissions and committees who have been looking at public safety and violence in Alaska for 40 years. And the results of that have been to chip away at the issue. But I think also now there is more widespread understanding that it's not just data and it's not just violence. These things are connected in our communities. We need to be looking at all of the issues together in order to address them holistically in a way that will hopefully change how we address it.
And Charlene, you're nodding your head. I'd like you to weigh in on this too.
Yeah, I appreciate what Alex is sharing. for data, at Data for Indigenous Justice, we've really dove in deep in trying to unpack the layers of the gaps of what's happening. But as Alex is saying, this isn't new, and that what we're trying to do is connect all the pieces and put it together so that our communities can show the patterns and the impacts and the losses that they're facing.
Charlene, in your position, does being a woman have any impact or insights when you're looking at some of the state statistics?
Can you repeat the question?
As in your position as a woman, do you think that plays a role in all in understanding and looking at some of the state statistics?
Yes, so this is a personal issue, and many of us across the state, all of our Alaska Native people, we're all impacted by this, right? And so we bring our heart into this work every day. As a survivor of violence myself, this is heart work each day that anyone who works in this is impacted by it, and we feel that when we do this work.
And we've got to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to turn our attention to law enforcement and to healing. Welcome back. We continue our discussion about the missing and murdered Indigenous persons crisis. So, Charlene, we asked both the Alaska State Troopers and the Anchorage Police Department to be part of our discussion. Both declined. You are a member of the Anchorage Public Safety Advisory Commission. What do you think of the fact that local law enforcement aren't here?
Yeah, I just want to say working with both of those organizations, those agencies, is very, very different. As my role on the Public Safety Commission, we have a really good working relationship with APD, and we're building a lot of trust and transparency, and we've established really good communication, and that looks not like the same. It's very different with the state troopers. We've had a little bit of collaboration when it came to doing some data training with the community from the state troopers, but likewise, we haven't had a lot of engagement with them as either.
And Brian, how do all these agencies work together from your point of view?
Well, from my perspective, they work well. I mean, one of the things we're doing as part of the Attorney General's MMIP initiative is we've formed an MMIP Alaska working group that we're working to put together some models under what's called helping tribes put together tribal community action plans mainly for missing person cases. And local and state law enforcement, the troopers are essential partners in that, are fully participating, fully engaged. So Alaska law enforcement people tend to work pretty closely in Alaska. It's kind of, we're all we got up here. Everybody counts on each other. So from my perspective, the troopers, APD, we all work very well together.
And Brian, one of the people we spoke with said that until we educate people about colonial violence and racism, these issues will continue. So what role do you think that racial and diversity sensitivity training and education should play in law enforcement?
Well, I think you see a lot of different law enforcement agencies, and Charlene mentioned APD, and I think that's a great example, that they do a lot of training on cultural issues and cultural sensitivity because they react to so many and deal with so many different cultures here in Anchorage. So it can only make a police officer better. I mean, we see many more police organizations adopting what's often called a more guardian culture, and I think you see that here in Alaska. And I think being able to be trained and understand different cultures can only make you better at that.
And Charlene, you wanted to respond to that.
As a commissioner with another person on the Public Safety Advisory Commission, we were able to attend and observe the cultural training actually last week here in Anchorage that APD puts on, and we're working on some feedback for APD on that because some of the training we had a lot of questions about. So I just wanted to kind of flag that, and yes, they do have a training in place, but right now we just had the recent opportunity to view that and to give some feedback on it.
And what are some of the areas you think need to be improved for that?
There were lots of amazing videos, which I give them a lot of credit. Anchorage is a very diverse place. Some of the videos, though, specifically for Alaska Native people, we wanted to revisit and make sure that they didn't reinforce stereotypes that are already prevalent in our communities. And we know that oftentimes stereotypes, though, people think it's just ideas about people, we know that those turn into actions and behaviors, and unfortunately violent behaviors. And so those are some of the ones that we're going to take another look at and see what we can do and hopefully give some feedback.
And Alex, a 2018 missing and murdered report shows that part of the problem was that states or local police departments were not keeping track of race in a way that allowed for transparency. How do you make it so that law enforcement does this properly?
Well, yeah, I think that you need to educate law enforcement about how to identify or ask questions about either the race or the citizenship of people who are harmed. I think that often it is easy to overlook Alaska Native people or in the lower 48 Native American people and assume that they are either mixed or white or Chicano or Latino, or just not ask the question. And it happens all over in the reports. Recently, the Washington Post pulled together a list of people in Alaska that were killed by law enforcement. And in reviewing that list with some community partners, just based upon individual knowledge, identified 2 people that had been misidentified as Asian as opposed to Alaska Native. So we think that if the expectation isn't set and if the training isn't provided, it's not going to change.
Brian, American Indians and Alaska Natives are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crimes and at least 2 times more likely to experience rape or sexual assault crimes compared to other groups. That's according to the Department of Justice. What more can be done to support meaningful efforts to address these high rates?
Well, I think we're trying to do that with, in the wake of the Attorney General's visit, we put a lot of resources into Alaska. There's been over $140 million has been put into Alaska from DOJ in the form of grants for different law enforcement groups, victims groups, trying to help make up that resource gap. That's one of those things we can do. And, we can talk and listen more. And that's something we've also been trying to do. Unfortunately, that becomes a little more difficult in the age of COVID. It's made it more difficult for us and for other law enforcement folks on the federal side, it's certainly, to get out into rural Alaska and try to open up that dialogue. But that's something we've been trying to do.
Alex, you wanted to weigh in on this as well.
Building off of what Brian mentioned about the federal support, the financial support, I think that an area for improvement is that these are grants. So these are 3 or 5 year grants. And when the grant ends, often the program goes away. So I think that there's a real interest, need, and a discussion that should be happening about making this federal money part of the base funding for tribal governments or tribal organizations in Alaska. Just imagine trying to run your local police department on a grant that you don't know from one year to the next whether or not it's going to you're going to get it again. It's very hard to provide consistent public safety, consistent access to justice without consistent funding.
And Brian, one issue in Alaska is that many places deal with a lack of police. How big of an impact could more troopers in remote parts of the state make?
Oh, I think that's pretty obvious that more law enforcement officers are going to help make up the gap in those different communities that don't have law enforcement officers. Whether it's troopers, whether it's additional VPSOs, VPOs, TPOs. That's something that some of this grant money has gone toward. Is over 50 new law enforcement officers out in the rural areas of Alaska to try to help make up that gap.
All right. So after another short break, we're shifting our attention to the future. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We talked about this a little bit, Brian. We talked about Operation Lady Justice, and that's the presidential task force for addressing the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous people. With a new administration coming in January, do you worry the focus will be taken away from this topic?
I don't. I mean, I think this is an issue that's now gotten plenty of attention. It certainly has plenty of attention within the Department of Justice. We're putting processes in place that are going to continue into the next administration, and I don't anticipate that we'll see, a lack of dedication to this topic.
Charlene, how do you think that we keep this topic in focus?
Yeah, so one of the things that I wanted to share and highlight was we recently wrote a letter. There are some nonprofit organizations and some tribes that signed on. We also have asked for better state partnerships, so we wrote a letter to the governor and asking about same kind of questions. Where do they stand on this, and how can we continue to work together at the state level? And so one of those is a budget request, and of course we have some drafts of legislation that we're looking forward to trying to share and find support for in the next coming months.
And Alex, what or who is missing, do you think, from this conversation at this point? What do you think is missing that needs to be implemented, or how do we remain on the right track?
Sure. So I think that having a law enforcement presence here would have been helpful to hear directly from the folks who are providing that service about their ideas. I think that continuing to build relationships, but more specifically to recognize the sovereignty and authority of Alaska tribes to respond to these issues locally is key. And I think that looking at the other issues that we know are connected, the disproportionality of not just the violence that impacts our Alaska Native communities, but the disproportionality of Alaska Native children that are removed from their homes and raised outside of their homes, the disproportionality of Alaska Native people within the Department of Corrections. In my mind, all of these issues are connected, along with access to strong social services and community programs. And without recognizing that each one of these perspectives brings something to this discussion, I think it's really easy to be siloed and to talk about public safety in one group, and to talk about what can we do to build tribal infrastructure in another group. I've participated in discussions around trying to increase VPSOs in rural areas, and you need folks at that discussion to talk about access to housing and how to build places that people are going to be able to live in to provide those VPSO services. But if we address them separately, it's really hard to move this forward.
And Charlene, what do you think? Do you think we're heading in the right direction finally at this point?
Yeah, I think, again, I really give a lot of credit, and I really honor the families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls who have continually came forward with their stories. And I really think the communities deserve a lot of credit for getting us here today so that we can continue this work. And so, yeah, I'm looking for many of the same things: strong partnership, a lot of transparency across local, state, and federal agencies.
And Brian, and for you, do you think we're heading in the right direction?
I do, and I would agree with Alex that a holistic view is the right approach. I mean, his point about housing is spot on. I mean, that's something we've seen, and we've actually worked with different groups to try to see if we could come up with some grant money or some other kind of funding or resources to help deal with the housing areas in a number of areas of rural Alaska, because that's a problem for almost all levels, from VPSOs, VPOs, TPOs, troopers, prosecutors. I mean, that's a problem across the board, and all those issues have to be looked at together.
And thank you for joining us tonight. I'd especially like to thank our guest, Brian Schroeder, the U.S. Attorney for the District of Alaska, Alex Cleghorn, Legal and Policy Director for the Alaska Native Justice Center, Charlene Uppuck with the Anchorage Public Safety Advisory Commission, and the Executive Director at Data for Indigenous Justice. We started the program with a question about why now. We asked the same question of Assistant Secretary of the Interior, Tara Sweeney.
Why not now, and why not before? I came into this position as Assistant Secretary with a very different background, and not one focused on law enforcement or the social aspects of the Alaska Native community and the greater Native American community. When I sat down with our law enforcement team and they began to brief me on the issues facing Indian country and Alaska Native communities, the issue of missing and murdered American Indians and Alaska Natives was an issue that clearly rose to the top in terms of a need for attention. And so for the last 2 years, we've been working together within the Bureau of Indian Affairs Office of Justice Services, within the Department of Justice, with Health and Human Services and the White House to shine a light on this issue, bring it to the national stage so that all equities have an opportunity to engage to find solutions to this pandemic.
As we said at the beginning, the topic of missing and murdered Indigenous people is large and complex, with multi-layered questions about data, policing, and victim services. We know we can't solve this issue in one discussion, but it's up to all of us to keep the conversation going. Thank you again for joining us.